It's tea time, fools.
Oh my god, Nintendo, oh my god. Hey guys, did you hear the news? Nintendo announced a new 2DS XL. That's right, new 2DS XL, clamshell shape, clamshell design, to come out on July 28th, I believe. And gamers, Nintendo fans lose their minds. What else is new? All right, Nintendo announces the new 2DS XL, and because they have never done hardware revisions, especially to their handhelds before. I guess there's kind of two camps. One camp is like, "Oh, 3DS, would you just die already? You rotting corpse, just die." And so when they see this 2DS XL, they think, it just won't die. It's like a zombie. It just won't die. And then the other camp is, speculating about what this possibly means for the Switch. And I guess I'm just kind of chillaxing in the middle, like, and this really doesn't mean anything. We're going to take a little trip down memory lane, for me to give my analysis on it. And like, none of us are right, like, or maybe we're both right, or all right, but I don't have, this isn't to say they're wrong or they're right, or I'm wrong or I'm right. I mean, obviously I feel like I'm right. That's why I'm giving my perspective, but I'm just going to use, I'm going to base my perspective in history and, try to give it, try to come from that angle. And, hopefully you'll see where I'm coming from. But, for the people, that are like, die already, 3DS, die, they're wrong. I'm just going to go out and say that they're wrong. And they must have no sense of Nintendo history. But that's why I'm here. That's why T is here to show you fools how this works. So I'm just going to start back. Let's start back with, say, the NES. The NES came out to great fanfare, to great commercial success. Sold, I believe, plus 60 million plus consoles. And Sega came out with their Sega Genesis in '89. And it caught Nintendo off guard because Nintendo, was living it up and they thought they had everything under wraps. And third parties jumped over there and started putting games on the Genesis because Nintendo was pretty hard on them in those days. And so Nintendo got a little scared. So they dropped the Super Nintendo in '91. And that means that the NES died, right? It died. No, the NES did not die. The NES went on to sell, to make tons of money into, I believe, '94. This is all stuff coming off the top of my head, so I might be off with some of the stuff. I feel like I'm kind of a Nintendo encyclopedia because I tend to remember this type of stuff. But yeah, they were making games. They were making new games for the NES in '93, '94, I believe, '94 at the latest, maybe even later than that, but definitely up to '94. So just because the Super Nintendo came out didn't mean the NES had to die or it should die. It was doing really well still. So people were still making games for it. But that doesn't mean that most companies transitioned over to the next thing, which was the Super Nintendo, obviously. And the Super Nintendo went on to be, at least from the fans' perspective, the most popular console from Nintendo to this point. So, the fan favorite console. And, so there's that perspective. And not only did Nintendo continue to make games for the NES, they made revisions to the NES after the Super Nintendo launched. If you remember the Toploader, which is kind of rare, I guess, but not really. The NES Toploader, which fixed a blinking problem, that tons of people had with the NES because of the way it was designed, the way the cartridges went in. So it had that blinking problem. People had to blow their cartridges and stick 2 cartridges in with a comb. And I'm telling you, the 2 cartridges with a comb thing, that's what we did, and it worked most of the time. So yeah, so they still released hardware after that. And I don't think anybody was like, oh man, enough with this NES stuff. You know, let's move on to the Super Nintendo. Put your focus there. No, people didn't do that. Gamers were different back then. So people didn't overreact to things. They just kind of went with the flow. Cool. New console. I'll buy that when I get some money or not. Or I'll buy the Sega Genesis. Whatever. So you have that. And so move on to Sega Genesis. Or move on to the Super Nintendo, I should say. They came up with this cool thing called the FX chip. Or the Mario chip. That was in Star Fox. It was in Donkey Kong Country games. And, you know, they didn't really, to my knowledge, to my perspective, they didn't really utilize that chip enough. They were kind of moving on, transitioning to the N64. But that came out, and the N64 came out, and the Super Nintendo died, right? No, Super Nintendo did not die in 1996, in September 96. It went on to sell, pretty well still, games and systems wise, and big games were still coming out for it. Like I believe a lot of the Kirby games were late. Obviously the Donkey Kong Country games came out late in the Super Nintendo's life, close to the launch. Actually, we didn't get a Star Fox 2. It was a completely done game. Star Fox 2 was completely done. And for whatever reasons, Nintendo decided, they didn't want to compete with the N64, dropping a new Star Fox game in 96. So they dropped it for whatever reasons. Well, not for whatever reasons, I just told you, but I think they still should have came out with it. But anyway, I mean, they continue to support the Super Nintendo into 98, I believe, 97, 98. So there's that. And let's move on to the, handhelds, because this is what we're talking about here. The Game Boy. I mean, how many variations of the Game Boy did we get? We got a Game Boy Color that wasn't actually a color screen. It was just color designs for the case, for the shell. It was kind of a troll move by Nintendo. People did get upset about that. It was like, we want a color screen, not a color box. And so Nintendo, I think maybe a year and a half later, finally gave us Game Boy Color, the actual color screen. And then not long after that, we got the Game Boy Advance. So something coming out late in the system's life doesn't mean they're trying to squeeze every ounce of profit they can. Obviously, the newer design, the newer model has cheaper parts, has less things going on, and you can make it for cheaper and sell it for cheaper, and people will buy it just because it's cheaper. So there's that happens all the time. And then you have the Game Boy Advance, which is the original Game Boy Advance. I didn't like that design. I did end up buying one because I got caught up in the hype. And so I got that. But then the SP came out and nobody cared about the original Game Boy Advance design, because the SP was so cool. It had a backlit screen finally. And the design was just better. It protected the screen by being a clamshell. That was the first. Well, not the first, because you can count the Game & Watches. But, as far as the actual handheld console, that was the first handheld console to have the clamshell design and protect the screen, and it was really cool. And it played Game Boy, all the Game Boy games up to Game Boy Advance, and that was cool. So people gravitated to that, and it sold really well. The Game Boy Advance SP especially went on to sell really well. They had many different designs of it, and Nintendo started talking about their pillar strategy. We're gonna have a Game Boy. We're gonna have the Game Boy go on. We have the DS, and we're gonna have our home console. The 3 pillars. They started talking about that, and then the DS came out, and nobody cared about the Game Boy Advance anymore. Nobody cared. You know why? Because one thing, the DS could play Game Boy Advance games. It had a Game Boy Advance slot, which was smart. And people were just done with the hardware at that point, like they are right now. A lot of people are just done with the Game Boy, done with the 2DS, 3DS hardware. Not just gamers, but designers and developers too. That's why you don't see a lot of bigger games, big companies supporting the 3DS, 2DS at this point. and I'll get to more of that later. But yeah, so that's, there's that. And then a year after the DS drops, Nintendo's most popular, highest selling hardware, handhelds and home consoles included, the DS came out and killed everything. And a year after the DS drops, Nintendo drops Game Boy Micro. Just out of left field. Like, what is this? Why are you doing this? We have a Game Boy Advance player on our DSs that we just bought. Why would we care about going back to the Game Boy Micro? Because it's small and it could fit in our pockets. It's a redesign? No. It sold not very well. I mean, it didn't sold terrible. It sold okay. It was a niche product, and we all moved on. And that was that. And the 2DS, or the DS came, did its thing, killed. The redesign, was it the DS? What was it called? The Nintendo DS Slim? I think that's what it's called, right? The Slim. So that came out, and that's the one that really killed. It was a great design, and it did really well. But, the hardware was dated. And so we were ready to move on in 2010, 2011. And that's when we got the Nintendo 3DS. Cool hardware. 3D was still pretty popular. It was just probably peaking at that time. And that was a cool thing to have the 3D screen and the more power. Some of the games were comparable to like Wii games. And it was pretty powerful. And, people stopped caring about the DS because you could play your DS games in your 3DS. And you can move on happily. And that was that. And, it was great. We got the new hardware. And we got, the cool screen. But, the clamshell design, again, Nintendo did their thing. They redesigned the thing to be sleeker. And they came out with the 3DS XL. That was the original one. And then they came out with the new 3DS, new Nintendo 3DS, and the smaller ones and the XL size. And most people buy, even to this day, buy the new Nintendo 3DS XLs, or just the regular 3DS XLs, or the smaller new Nintendo 3DSs. And so, the 3D thing started to die. No one cared anymore. It was, kids, they were worried about kids' eyes and in their development of their eyes and all that stuff. And so Nintendo comes out with the 2DS. Said, all right, we're done with the 3D. This is a better console for your kids. You don't have to worry about the 3D slider or none of that stuff. It's the battery's better. It's more efficient. And that was that. And they thought, and I thought too, that it was so crazy because a lot of people had been wanting that. And it sold decent. It didn't sell terrible, but it sold decent. And people liked the clamshell design. And, even though the 2DS is a pretty sturdy little tank, it's, your screen still gets scratched up. My son has one. He drops his all the time. There's scratches all over the thing. And so Nintendo, a couple of years later decides we like the efficiency, the cheapness of, as far as the parts go, of the 2DS. But, it's not the hardware is kind of old. The design is old. The people like the clamshell more. That design sells way more than the old Game Boy Advance style look, or old Game Boy look. And people, let's do a cheaper version of the 2DS, but with that design. And I don't know about the hardware. I don't know if it has I'm guessing because it's called new, it has the 3DS XL, the new Nintendo 3DS XL hardware in it, which is, it has a little boost in hardware there. But the only difference is it doesn't have the 3D screen. And the 3D screen hurts a lot of games. It hurts a lot of developers. If you bought Pokemon Moon and Sun, they don't even use the 3D for most of the game. I don't even remember seeing 3D in that game because, again, the hardware is old. It's taxing on games to have the 3D as well, and then the two screens. So that takes, a lot of hardware juice. and the 3DS, 2DS isn't that powerful a console, even with the hardware boost, the hardware revision, and the new version. So like that's all this is. And of course, there are still 2DS games coming out or 3DS games coming out because the system, there's a 60 million, 65 million, 66 million install base. And games started a year ago, 2 years ago on this console. And they're going to finish those games on this console. And a lot of those games are coming out now and they'll come out into next year. And that's a normal thing. All you have to do is look at the history to see that. And I don't think this means anything for the Switch, or because a lot of those 3DS must die people are afraid that this is going to mean that's going to take games away from the Switch or any of that stuff. And that's just not the case. Like these games were made on the 3DS, 2DS, and they were in development for some time. And like there's Pikmin. I like Pikmin. Pikmin is not a large franchise, and this is a spin-off of a not large franchise, So we're not talking about a big game in development for quote-unquote new hardware, which is not new hardware. It's old hardware. And it's just a hardware revision, which we see every manufacturer make. Didn't we just get a Xbox One Slim? Didn't we just get that? Didn't we just get a slim version of PS4 and elite version, the pro version of PS4? Like this is stuff that happens all the time. I don't think that meant anything. I don't think the slim PS4 meant anything for the PS4 other than we want to squeeze every ounce we can and make more money by selling a cheaper product to people who would buy it if it was cheaper. That's all there is. And then we have this elite model, the pro model, for people who are willing to spend the money. That's all this is. This doesn't mean anything. This isn't to prolong the 2DS or the 3DS. This isn't a system to do that. Because if you're going to do that, you make it more powerful. If you want to prolong something, you don't just redesign its shape. You don't take away a feature. I mean, that's basically all this is. This is a Nintendo 3DS, a new Nintendo 3DS XL that doesn't have the 3D. This is not adding anything new. It took that away to make it cheaper, to make it a better impulse buy. If you walk into a game store or any retail, and you see it, and it's like, oh, that's the big one. I like the bigger one. Most people like the bigger screens on their handhelds because handhelds are already small, and to have the biggest screen, you want that. I love it. Like I had the original of most of Nintendo's handhelds, and the bigger screens are better. It just makes the games pop better, and that's all this is. So, yeah, that's my take. I don't think there's a reason to freak out on either spectrum. The guys who want 3DS to die, it's going to die in its time. You're not going to see, if you see new Super Mario 3D World 2 announced, if you see Super Mario 3D Land 2 announced, or Luigi's Mansion Dark Moon 2 announced, or a new Metroid game, or, something of that ilk announced for the 3DS, then you can maybe get worried, because that means there are big games still coming to the 2DS, 3DS. But at this point, I don't see them. I don't think Nintendo's going to really surprise us with 2DS, 3DS announcements at E3 or beyond. So I don't see anything to be worried about here. I'm just sitting here like, there's no reason to be mad about this thing either. I just told you why it makes sense for Nintendo to do it. But I also told you that it doesn't mean anything as far as Switch or Nintendo's future. That's my take on it anyway. Let me know what you think in the comments below. As always, thank you guys for listening and watching. And I'll see you fools next time. Peace out.
Oh yeah, one more thing. Play Nintendo, fools.